My name's Angela Wilkinson. I'm delighted to be facilitating this very esteemed panel, which is on the topic of connectivity for prosperity. And in the spirit of a foresight intervention, or for people who are really interested in making the future, I would like to be able to move this session from thinking the unthinkable to implementing the imaginable. And I would like to start by inviting our first speaker, and I just have to say there's been a minor revolution in the ranks. We've just changed the speaking order. I'm just preparing Alan. You're up front first. Alan James is going to speak to us first about transportation. He's the VP of Worldwide Business Development for Hyperloop One, based in Los Angeles. And he's going to talk about transportation as one of humanity's greatest levers for economic growth and also for cultural and social development, and a new type of transport.
Indeed. I'll do it from over here, if I may. Thank you, Chair. Great to see you all here. I'm Alan James, and I have the immense privilege of being the Global Vice President of Hyperloop One. First question I always get asked is, what is a Hyperloop? Everybody may be aware that Elon Musk had the general idea of doing some super fast transport. He published that in August 2013 and then said, I'm too busy with the rockets, with Tesla and being a generic Renaissance man. So challenge to everybody out there, just go and make it happen. So here is a Hyperloop. We probably need to make this a bit brighter or turn the lights down. Fundamental principle is it's not a train. Forget a TGV. You don't need 1,000 people to show up for it to be economically viable. The vehicle is a pod. A pod can take a maritime container, or it can take passengers or air freight. Second principle, the pods operate in tubes. That creates a controlled environment, then enabling us to do autonomous driving, and autonomous driving much more easily than you can do out on the road. Then we take the air out of the tube. This is the big idea. That enables us to go very fast. We propel the system using a linear motor and forget wheels. Of course, we levitate. But this isn't old school maglev like Transrapid, the German system of the last century. This uses passive maglev. It's the motion of the vehicle that creates the levitation. So we're combining all of those innovations into a new piece of technology, as Anne just said, a completely new transport mode. And we can go really fast. And by really fast, our design speed is 1,080 kilometers an hour, 300 meters a second. Just think it takes Usain Bolt 10 seconds to run 100 meters, then do the math. So, what's the company? Hyperloop One. Hyperloop One is the company that's actually building Hyperloop. Elon Musk outsourced the idea, and there's a load of people with PowerPoints out there saying, we are Hyperloop. We're the people who are actually building it. These are kind of out of date now. These are shots from our test and development site, DevLoop, in the Nevada desert. About 4 weeks old, these shots now. As we speak, we are building the world's first Hyperloop test track. Here we are, craning the tubes into place. Some of the ports you see on the side are where the control gear and the vacuum pumps will go on. It's in situ now. We're cutting the metal, pouring the concrete. Our business is run by a great team of innovators at our downtown Los Angeles campus. We have 200 of the world's best engineers from aerospace, from autonomous driving, and from associated fields in control and systems. We have great people from around the world having intense discussions, and a secret tip to all innovators, we have great lunches as well. And double secret tip, if you want real innovation, over-order the lunch, and then there's always dinner left over and nobody goes home. And as you can tell from the whiteboard on the far side, this is where the best ideas happen. This is where the comms guys meet the levitation people. This is where the civil engineers and the project finance people come together. With that great team, we're able to build Hyperloop really fast. And this next little piece takes us through what we've already got and what we're now putting together. We've tested this. This is our propulsion system, the linear motor. This is the last time you'll see rails. We built this in May and tested it. We're now stretching the vehicle, building the pod on the chassis, levitating the chassis, putting the pod in the tube, integrating all the bits of Hyperloop, and we're ready to go. So our aim is to get to a fully operational, full-scale prototype. And we'll do that at our Nevada Desert test site. Some people think it's science fiction. Some people think it's decades away. Some people think it's years away. It isn't. It's happening within weeks from now. You will be able to see and feel a real live Hyperloop levitating under a fully autonomous control in vacuum. There's global interest in our technology. We launched something called the Hyperloop Global Challenge. And we invited cities, regions, and countries to compete to have a breakthrough mode of transport in their territory. And it's pretty obvious where the smarts are around the world. Here in the European Union, there's a sort of new Hansa taking place in the Baltic, smart Baltic. Even the Americans are saying, hey, can we have some ground transport? Everybody else thinks it's good for the economy. Return of one of my favorites from the 80s and 90s in economic geography, the golden banana of innovation, from Edinburgh to Barcelona, problematized only by recent democratic events in the UK, for which I apologize. There's some obvious 21st century super corridors going on there as well. And West Africa, trying to do in transport what it's done in telecom, skip the fixed line generation, go straight to hypermobility. We are, of course, planning European Union projects right now. Some will have seen that the world's first Hyperloop business case has been published. KPMG and Ramboll did it for us with our local partners. That takes Helsinki and Stockholm, where you can currently spend 3.5 hours getting from central business district to central business district by the time you got out to the airport, got on the plane, got back in from the airport, or 17.5 hours on a ferry which largely exists for duty-free booze shopping. We transform that 17.5 hours into 28 minutes. We turn the Nordics into a super city. The results that have come out of the study are basically, over a whole life term, our costs will be about 50% of high-speed rail. And I can go into detail and compensation later. But the benefits, including wider economic benefits, will be 3.5 to 4 times greater. Because what's happening is hours are becoming minutes, multiple countries are becoming a super region, and many cities are becoming a unified economy. This is radical transport delivering radical economic benefit. And the radical transport, and this is the very first time this picture has been seen in public, will look something like that. That's a pod in a tube, in motion, levitating. It's not just the pod, it's the network. Most people think of transport as A to B, and a lot of transport is A to B. So let's say that's 300 kilometers, a typical TGV kind of route. In scale time, we do it in 18 minutes. A high-speed train might take 1 hour and 10. Conventional rail will take 2 hours and 10 minutes. And if you are idiot enough to try to drive, it'll take you 4 to 5 hours, because although the motorway may have a 110 or 130 km/h speed limit, it's actually 70 km/h or less on average by the time you've driven into and out of the cities. But network means network. There's a lot of things between A and B, and a typical European geography will have many of these. Some will have all, some will have more. So a Hyperloop One network does this. It links everywhere to everywhere. And using our fully automated control system, which uses basically the principles of internet packet switching, this is how we run the network. Every journey is non-stop. So if you're going from the port to the distribution center and you're a container, your journey is one stop. If you're going from your commuter zone to a part of metropolitan area A, your journey is non-stop. Likewise, all the other places on the network are non-stop journeys, which means nothing gets in the way of through traffic, which means all journeys are fast. We've solved the TGV problem. You can't slow down a TGV to stop because it eats capacity on the network. We do networking in a radically different way. And of course, at each end, we will integrate with existing public transport. This is some of our early stage work on how we would integrate Helsinki into Hyperloop into Helsinki station. Of course, reusing the existing transport corridor. But we're also thinking more radically. Jeff mentioned this morning the Dubai Futures Accelerator. They've taken us on. We're kind of the poster child for Dubai Future right now. It is about a pod in a tube, but it's also about autonomous vehicles coming out of the pod and giving you a single-seat journey from your origin to your destination. And you might not even know you're in a vehicle. It might look like a domestic space. So I'd like to conclude now with what's the EU opportunity here. It's a proof of operations facility, and I'm delighted to say that we've had extraordinarily good responses from the Finnish and the Dutch governments. No surprise, they're two of the most innovative governments on earth. Proof of ops facility takes what we have in Nevada, which will be proof of tech. We are now considering a major inward investment into the European Union to build a proof of ops facility, which is where we get regulatory approval that enables us to deliver and deploy this around the world. We're seeking to agree it in principle in 2016, plan it in 2017, get the first 15 km on the ground in 2018, and extend it to a 50 km scale in 1920. Indicatively, the capex is around 3 billion. This is the deal that we wish to negotiate. We will bring to the table our global investor base, and there are some of the smartest investors in the planet on that. We'll open the private sector side to EU companies, maybe those wishing to participate in the Hyperloop One supply chain. That's our inward investment. We're looking for an inward investment deal from a host location. Critically, it's got to be a single point of contact. We can't have 12 conversations with the regulator, the inward investment, the economic development. We need EU national and local policies aligned. Then we need the permit to operate as an R&D facility. We need the land, the right-of-way, and the premises. And why would a location make us that kind of deal? It's because you get competitive advantage. 600 of the highest skilled jobs imaginable, all EU local hires on the ground in the European Union. 1,000 indirect supply chain jobs we're anticipating. A Future Mobility Institute absolutely required by us to retrain today's systems engineers into Hyperloop engineers. And the big one, we are a thing connected to the internet. We are part of the Internet for Things, the Internet of Things. We are also the very definition of mobility as a service. We will be opening up our software platform to people who want to build an ecosystem on that. All of that adds up to competitive advantage for the host location here in Europe, exportable expertise. These are the European sectors that we think synergize very well with what we need. And here's the European Union's advantages, and this is the dialogue that we need to have as a company with the Union. You've got best in world intellectual property protection here. That's critically important to us. You've got world leadership in innovation and mobility. And somebody's flicked that. Okay.
Got a minute.
Yeah, okay, I know. Last slide. And this is the big one for us. The European Union is the best in the world at transport regulation and safety case. It's difficult to get a transport safety case in the European Union, and we know it, and that's why we want to do it here. Not only because that gives us access to the whole EU market, but we know that an EU safety case and regulatory approval will be accepted in many other markets too around the world. And finally, to quote Commissioner Bulc, disruptive innovation must be in the lead in transport. We agree. So, to give a bit of context, I'll conclude with, what happens if it's a major moment in transport history, when a completely new mode comes along? Imagine, politically or commercially, you've just invested in that, but your investment doesn't buy you a steam locomotive or the company that makes a steam locomotive. It buys you a share in the transformation that happened. And that is what happened after 1829. It's now 2016 and the Hyperloop revolution has begun. I look forward to welcoming you all on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That gives a completely new meaning to the phrase "in the pipeline."
Thank you.
I'd like to invite Pascal Lamy, who's the president of Emeritus of the Jacques Delors Institute, and of course served 2 consecutive terms as Director General of the WTO, and was a European Trade Commissioner. Has a long and illustrious CV. But you're going to talk to us about the connectivity for prosperity, and I just want to go to one of the things you put into your 300 words or your brief piece, which says, more connectivity does not work for sustainable prosperity under any conditions, and you're calling for a shift.
Thanks, Angela. Back to the present with some ingredient of future and 3 short points as a contribution to this discussion. Number 1, connectivity can work for prosperity, can. Number 2, but it's not always the case. And 3, increased connectivity doesn't only lead to efficiencies and prosperity. Now, number 1, I think we will all agree. I don't think I need to spend a lot of time explaining why economic theory, experience, what we know, what we've been doing, is firmly supports the notion that increased connectivity can lead and usually leads to more efficiency. And the best example of that being trade, which is an area I happen to know a bit. And we know that each of the big technological revolutions that happened and that generated waves of trade increase and increase in trade relations was generated by innovation in the transport system, which is the main things which comes to mind when you talk about connectivity, provided you integrate the fact that goods have to be transported, but services has also to be transported, which is information transport. Now, once you include information transport in this concept of connectivity, it's pretty obvious that changes that happened in the way ships used to sail allowed ships to sail with the front wind, and then you had steam, and then you had electricity. Each of these revolutions, Hyperloop, maybe the next one, each of these revolutions led to a formidable increase in connectivity, hence a formidable increase in localization, multi-localization of production systems. And it's this multi-localization of production systems, whether goods, whether services, through increased exchange that leads to greater efficiencies for simple reasons, which Mr. Ricardo and Mr. Schumpeter theorized at their time. At a time, by the way, where the cost of distance was still hugely important for international trade. They built the theory, both of them thinking it would never happen the way they theorized it. You know, it's like these mathematicians who make a calculation that there is a star somewhere there, but it's only 200 later that, because of the progress of technology, you realize that the star is there because you can see it. Well, that's exactly what's happened with connectivity and efficiencies. We now are in a world where the cost of distance is moving to 0. Maybe not 0, maybe hour instead of day, like Hyperloop, or minute instead of hour, but 0. So on this, I think it's absolutely clear. More to come in increased connectivity, bringing more efficiencies. Point number 2, more efficiency is not automatically more prosperity. There is a distance between efficiency, growth of economic production, whatever form it takes, and prosperity. Efficiency is something which is with numbers, with science, with assuming economy is a science. Prosperity is with happiness. It's a feeling. It's a symbol. It's not something you can measure. And there is a big distance between efficiency and prosperity. And let me just take 2 examples of that. This Ricardo-Schumpeterian system, which is more and more efficient, bumps into A, social problems on the one side, B, ecological problems on the other side. Why is it so? Because Ricardo Schumpeter explained extremely well how this happens, but the underlying assumption is that there is no collective cost. There is no serious externality to this increase in efficiencies, and that's not true. We know the impact of rapid and sometimes violent international division of labor on people, on workers, on human capital. You do not deal with destruction and creation of human capital without serious political problems. Because at the end of the day, this has to do with people. Same reasoning on the ecological side. The markets, their expansion, increased connectivity, increased international development brings formidable efficiencies, provided your price system properly reflects externalities. And we know that in the case, for instance, of CO2 emission, it is not the case. So you can create a lot of economic efficiencies, but a lot of negative externalities. And the only way to do that is to redress the system of relative prices. But with the wrong system of relative prices, efficiency does not lead to prosperity. And hence, probably some of these reactions to globalization, either on the social side or on the ecological side. On the social side, the sort of new appeal to going back to proximity, and we have exactly the similar reaction on the ecological side. I think it's a huge approximation, notably because in my view, connectivity is only one emerged part of globalization, and globalization is only one emerged part of the way global market capitalism works. Third and last point, increased connectivity has a lot of impact and consequences that go beyond the sphere of economic systems, of production systems. We have to look, if we want to understand what's happening today and what will happen tomorrow, because I have no doubt that we are moving with digitalization to something which would be hyper-connected, and notably with domotics and so on. We have to, and I hope we can do that, including today, we have to go beyond economics to things that have to do with culture, that have to do with identity, that have to do to belonging. How does increased connectivity, and notably the total decentralization of connectivity, which social networks are about, how does this impact groups, tribes, cities, nations, collectivities? How does this impact the symbolic architecture which people have in mind in terms of belonging, in terms of us, in terms of them? I think this is largely unexplored, although you start finding proper studies by sociologists or anthropologists, more generally by social science. But I think as compared to what we've done in economics, this social science side of understanding how connectivity moves culture needs to be explored, and that's my conclusion. If we really want connectivity to work for prosperity, we have to give a much larger say than we've done today to social science. So let economists aside for a moment and let's listen to anthropologists. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've moved from great hope to a cautionary note, and I just want to bring all of our panelists in before we start opening up the conversation. So I'd like to invite Simon Schäfer, who's, I would call you a serial entrepreneur, but not in the morning breakfast sense, who is the CEO and founder of Factory, which is fundamentally about the role of entrepreneurs and startups in connectivity for prosperity. Please.
Thank you for having me here. Yes, I want to talk from inside the trenches, so to speak, of entrepreneurship. I brought one slide only. I won't take you through a whole presentation. And this is about how we put a lot of entrepreneurs into one building in Berlin and the impact that that had around us, around the business we've created, and potentially on society. So inside the building, we brought together a mix of the best of entrepreneurship that we could find in Berlin. And the reasoning was pretty simple. At the time, in 2013, Berlin was at the cusp of being a very significant tech entrepreneurship ecosystem, but not really there yet. It was mostly about the Zamver brothers that were copying businesses, scaling businesses with ideas that were from somewhere else, but not necessarily about innovation. And having invested at the time in about 45 companies at very early stages, lots of mistakes, some successes, I realized that bringing the best together into one space and having them help each other, coming from a culture of meritocracy and supporting each other significantly, might be a good idea. So in first year of operation, the companies inside our building generated 102 jobs. They raised in excess of 180 million euros in venture capital funding. They engaged in total 170 million people with their products and with what they were doing. Something that we're very proud of, there was a 39% female workforce inside those companies, which is not geeks with pizzas coding all night, but it was a very diverse corporate culture that was created through the companies in that round. Yeah, and I think what that leads us to, and what's so important to me also to maybe contribute to this conversation here, is that the learning effect of what people are doing inside these companies, very important to notice, 9 out of 10 of these companies actually fail and do not succeed. But what the people in these companies learn is something you cannot learn in academia. It is something that is at the utmost highest level of innovation on where entrepreneurship can be in the digital and connected age. And when we look at how we in Europe sometimes characterize the business and technology that we see, Google being predominant, Facebook being predominant, most of the companies not actually from Europe that dominate this technological development, I think it's really important to understand that we need to find regulations, that we need to engage with entrepreneurs on a level where we make that innovation as possible, as humanly possible. So we need to find regulations that are flexible, that work with entrepreneurs, that are designed in co-creation with entrepreneurs in order to make or potentially create those kind of companies that provide an infrastructural component to that technology that we're looking at that changes the world right now. I think it's very important to note that when we look at in 1997, when we looked at Microsoft and how Microsoft was about to dominate the world, a couple of years later, 2004, Google came around the corner, then Facebook. So we know that we don't know where all this is heading. And if that is true, and if we know that 9 out of 10 companies are actually failing, then we need to really embrace this technological advancement, and not just by supporting the societal components, not just by making sure that we perceive entrepreneurs as something that is not to criticize, but to be supported. I remember the evil guy in all German criminal movies is always the entrepreneur. Surprise, surprise. We have to actually make sure that we understand what these guys need and try to adopt our regulatory environments to support these agile environments, because, as I've said before, we don't know where it's heading and we have no idea what comes next. But if there's any chance of Europe to step up the game and be a part of that next layer of innovation in the internet, basically we have to take that extremely serious and be aware that the change has just started. And that's where I'd like to conclude.
So if I hear it, that's another form of connectivity between entrepreneurs and regulators that enables the shaping and enabling role of innovation to have more social impact and benefit. So now I'm going to turn on the theme of social benefit to Mark Spelman. Mark was the Global Head of Strategy and Global MD for Thought Leadership of Accenture for a while. And now you were the Executive Director for the Accenture Institute for High Performance. And now you're currently engaged with the World Economic Forum, leading the Future of the Internet Initiative. And I read your piece, and the word social benefit springs out at me all the time. So connectivity for prosperity, how do we secure social benefit?
Thanks, Angela. So 2 key messages for you. One is exponential, and the second one is value. Exponential, because what is going to happen over the next sort of 15 years, it's not one technology, but it's the combinations of technologies working together, which is going to make an exponential impact. But secondly, when we talk about value, we typically think about value in industrial contexts. And what I want to argue is that we need to think a lot more about societal value. So if I think about technologies and I think about what's happening with digital, you can go through data analytics, cloud, artificial intelligence, machine learning, virtual reality. You can see how those are working together. But what becomes really interesting is when you actually put those together with 3D printing, with advanced materials, with energy storage, and with some of the things that are going on in space. And what makes a real difference is, if you like, that ubiquitous connectivity in real time. Because if you just think for a moment about the way that we make decisions, most of our decision making is based on historic data. But the moment that you've got everything from your smart city, your smart factory, your smart home, your smart person, in terms of your bodily functions, all wired up together, ubiquitous connectivity, real-time information, you change the basis of decision-making. And if you put that into an industrial context, first of all, the industrial context, think about what's happening in terms of demand and supply and business models. On the demand side, essentially by 2027, in most of our European countries, we will be buying 40%, 50% of our products online. Now, what is really happening in that sort of situation? Well, it's the issues around choice, control, and convenience. And if you listen to the presentations this morning, I would argue what you're going to see in the retail sector is very similar to the things that we were talking about this morning in terms of how power is going to evolve. Because essentially what's happening is power is going to the individual in terms of determining the choices that he's actually making. And the way that's happening is because of the power of iteration and patterns. It's not the first time that you hit Google that they've actually sort of captured some information about you. But by the time you've hit it 99 times, you've created a pattern. And if you think about 40% of your shopping online, you're creating patterns. And it's the algorithms behind understanding and interpreting the patterns which become very important. So the principle going forward is going to be around algorithmic governance. On the supply side, we talked a lot this morning about sort of skills. What I would argue is that we spend a lot of time talking about automation, not nearly enough time talking about augmentation and how things like artificial intelligence can help us not only with the way that we think, but what we do, how we learn, and even how we sort of feel. And I would argue that augmentation of the workforce is going to be the critical issue if we really want to counterbalance the forces of automation. So it's about iteration, it's about the power of augmentation of the workforce. And the world that we're moving to is everything is becoming a service. Everything that we do, whether it's the service of buying jet engines, whether it's about cars in cities, whether it's about wanting to be personal well-being, everything is going to become a service. So by the 2020s, we're going to be buying everything by the drink, pay by the use. It's data-driven business models. That's the world in which we're going to sort of operate in. And so industry value will shift because the power is in the data, the power is in the ability to bring that information to consumers. And the companies that are able to, if you like, leverage that data, be able to translate it into performance management will be the ones that, if you like, secure the value. Now, the really interesting thing is that we don't talk about the opportunities around how do you create value for society. So if you think about the ways that you can create value for society using this power of this digital technology, if you can save lives, reduce time, cut CO2 emissions, then you begin to get into some very interesting opportunities to create societal value. So if you look around and look at what happens today, here are a couple of examples. You look at the number of lorries in cities. 75% of lorries in cities on the back journeys are empty. Now, if you could reduce the number of empty backhaul lorries significantly, A, you get lorries off the road, B, you cut emissions, and C, you might actually even be able to cut the costs of using those lorries because actually you're able to get better utilization. The problem is that 97% of lorry owners and fleet owners in Europe have less than 20 trucks. But that's a fantastic opportunity where if you can collaborate and bring parties together, put a platform together, match demand, match supply, there's a societal benefit. But to do that, regulators can't do it on their own, hauliers can't do it on their own, individual sort of companies can't do it on their own. You've got to be able to collaborate. Another example, if you can put together insurance companies, auto manufacturers and policymakers, we know through the data that if you've got an automatic braking system in your car, you reduce the number of collisions by 7%. If you've got forward braking and advanced braking systems, as we see in the cars today, you can reduce collisions by 15%. That is a societal benefit. Less people in hospitals, less accidents, less use of emergency sort of services. The question is, how do we capture that? And I would argue that if we start beginning to think in terms of societal value, as well as in terms of industrial value, then we'll begin to think, I think, in more and new and different and enlightened ways of how we want to define prosperity. Because I think one of the challenges is not just what we were talking about this morning, which is about how do, if you like, elites keep up to speed and engage with general populations. I think we've got too narrow a definition of value. Value seen too much through the lens of just industry, and we're not thinking enough about how we can use the power of digital to essentially, I think, capture and use societal value for the well-being of all.
Well, they're four very different interventions and a difficult red thread, but there are some interesting paradoxes coming up, and I'm going to open the floor soon for some conversations. But if Mark, we're very successful in using information technologies to reduce transport congestion and impact, then the business case for Hyperloop becomes a little bit more difficult. If, on the other hand, Hyperloop can also demonstrate societal benefits, then it becomes less problematic. And Pascal, if we were talking about everything becoming a service, what does that mean for how we regulate trade to make sure that there's societal benefits from global value chains in service rather than that, and that the concept of connectivity, not just at distance, but of different startups to enable there to be some form of productive social benefit, which also thinks about the new infrastructures that need to be to support those, that comes to mind. So there are definitely common themes and some differences in the panel. So, who has a question they would like to ask? Gentlemen in the... we need a microphone. There's a question here. Are there any more? And a question over there. Question, that's that gentleman there. And then there's one behind, 2 rows behind. There's a gentleman who wanted to ask a question.
Okay, I'm always worried about being first into these Q&A sessions because I actually work for the home organisation. But my name is Adam Watson-Brown. I work in DG Communications Networks. And I wanted to ask Mr. Spelman in particular about these notions of societal return. Actually quite difficult to measure, not really recognised by the type of audit company that he has worked for. Social return on investment, SRI, actually somewhat discredited methodology. So I found when I looked into it. So I guess my question is directed to him. What can he do what can his disciplines do to improve the measurement and the recognition of societal value.
Okay, well, I wonder if we could ask, there's a technical question there, but I actually think the concept of social return on investment is something that everybody might want to have a comment on in the panel.
Let me address that in two ways. Actually, what I will tell you today is 2 governments in the European Union are actually doing this exercise for themselves. And the key issue is it's all around what assumptions you make, particularly around things like lives saved, CO2 emissions reductions. So I agree with you absolutely that you have to be extremely clear about the assumptions that you're making around the values that you put. The thing that's really interesting about this, though, is it's the first time that you're beginning to see some efforts made to quantification. And I think that's important. The quantification, I think, gives you directionally the right way to go. The really important thing, though, is if the magnitudes are correct, what it then gives you is the focus for action. And my key message is, yes, quantification is part of the story. What is really more important, though, is in this interconnected world, we need much more collaboration around the areas where we think there's opportunity. Transport, I think, is a really interesting opportunity where there are all sorts of societal benefits which you can see from things like reduced traffic congestion in cities all the way through to improved air quality. How ultimately you value that, I think you can debate. But I think directionally there's a huge opportunity for us here, and we're not talking enough about it. And I will say the UK and the Danish governments are 2 governments at the moment which are actively thinking about that as part of their digital strategies going forward. And I think there's a huge opportunity to build on it.
Okay, would anyone of the other panellists on social return on investment or social value?
No. I'll just tell you an anecdote. I've been working for a long time pro bono in an advisory position with Danone, who invented a few years ago a special investment fund, which was called Danone Ecosystem, to try and improve the relationship between the activities of this company and its environment. And as part of this program, we funded a program in Egypt, the purpose of which was to increase the yield of the milk yield of cows.
The milk yield of cows.
Yeah. These cows were producing 15 kilos of liters of milk, and there was a program that lifted this to 35, which was a great economic success. And we were all extremely happy that we had contributed to increasing the value of the cows for those who own cows, because they were much more efficient, much more productive. Until the day we sent a team of evaluation with anthropologists, sociologists. And they came back a few weeks later saying, sorry guys, but you've put a terrible mess in these communities. Men and women are now at war. There is a war between men and women. And the reason for that was very simple. In these communities, women were collecting the milk from the cows and getting the money from the milk. And they would give to the men a small part of that so that they do what men do when women work, for instance, drink. And that was fine, and there was a perfect equilibrium in these communities, until the moment the yield doubled and the money doubled. And then men said, what's my part of that? And women said, nothing. I mean, you're not going to drink twice as much because my cow is producing twice as much milk. And the guy said, oh, no, I want my share. This is something we have in common. You give me my normal share, so you double my drinking money. And of course, women said, no, that's for the kids, that's for retirement, that's for... And it was a mess. So I'm taking this example because it came to my mind listening to this great story about creating social value. Okay, you can create that, but you have to be extremely careful on what you do with the existing tissue of human relationship and of the way these communities work. So, again, a note of caution.
Sure. Again, from a tech entrepreneurship perspective, because I think if we're looking at technology and how it's driven, many of the innovations are actually driven by these guys that invent products. Looking at how diversity plays a significant role in creating these companies and corporate culture, I think it's worth noting that the people that are going through the process of learning how to build a startup will then probably be better equipped than anybody coming from academia or out of studying to do the same thing yet again. And as I mentioned in my numbers, 39% female workforce inside the companies there. That is significant. I think that is a very important fact. That's something we've been trying to achieve in many other verticals, and tech is actually one of those where that happens already. And last comment, the barrier of entry to becoming an entrepreneur. If you compare where we are today to 1997 and where people would have a degree in computer sciences to actually found a company, today 3 people can build a company that's worth $1 billion and sells to Facebook. That's brand new. That's something that just happens. And I think it's worth noting that some of the motive of the entrepreneurs to build more companies and to invest in entrepreneurs around them is not actually to make money. Then they would go to Cayman Islands and buy a yacht. But they actually reinvest in their peers to create an ecosystem that is self-sustainable. And the first inclinations of that we've seen in Silicon Valley. It's now almost spreading like a virus to other cities. And I think it's exactly that is just starting. And that tech component, no business in the future is going to not have a tech component. Whether you do procurement, sales, marketing, whatever you're doing, you're going to be somehow involved with the internet. So learning these tools and making sure that that part of our society and of course economics is future compatible is where tech entrepreneurship can be a role model, I think.
There's a question over here. Any more questions in the room? You have to put your hand right up so that the mics can find you. There's one here and one over there. And, sorry, there's a gentleman here. And ladies, wake up.
Enrico Giovannini, sorry for coming back to
We can hear you.
ask questions. I will do it without it. Until a few years ago, expenditures in research and development was considered a cost in the accounting. Now, of course, it is an investment. But we are still considering expenditures for human capital, training, and so on as a cost and not as an investment. We heard this morning that the human dimension, and Pascal repeated also at social scale, is so fundamental. But we are considering this just as a cost. Doesn't make any sense for a company, for a country through national accounts, and for the entire world. Are we doing the right thing?
Okay. Can I take the next question?
A question based on a proposition that all economics is about the creation of value and all politics is about the distribution of that value. The connectivity we talked about, I think is increasingly, there's an increasing belief that value in the future will be about the manipulation of the data that's created by the thousands of interactions we have with the world every day. And Google or others are examples of that already. Right now, all people get out of their data that they generate is free internet. And if that is the source of the future wealth of countries and societies, I'm not so sure that social benefits from that are going to be sufficient to satisfy people when they. That is more or less the argument we have all made about trade in the past. Don't worry, you will benefit from this. And oh, by the way, when your incomes don't rise, don't worry about that. You get cheaper T-shirts or cheaper computers. We know that people don't accept that. We live in societies where our value is in part defined by our income. Our ability to live is defined by our income. And our politics is still all about income. And how do we address the political challenges of a data-driven society where value added is increasingly created by the manipulation of my data, but I get nothing out of that?
Thank you. And there was one more question.
A really quick and rapid question to Professor Spelman. I had the impression that you consider value quite as the maximum utility of the area being scrutinized via data. But often you can see that decision and actions refer to a clash of values with positive and negative consequence of the actions being carried out. Then is the maximum utility for the scrutinized, let's say, data being addressed, the element that you indicate as the value to follow? And are we going to use data mining as the value generator for the next years?
Okay, that question. Right, so we have 3 questions. Please, panel, take them as you want. R&D as a cost, data-driven value add, and who gets the value out of the data? Sorry, R&D as a cost, data-driven value creation, and who gets the value out of the data that's being used or manipulated by the new companies or firms. And then a question, I think, which was around data mining and data security. Was that, and its relation to value? I'm not quite sure I understood your question, but those, if I give those to the panel, and I still am waiting for a response from Pascal on services.
Well, if you want it now. You're right. The servicification of economies raises new issues about trade regulation, assuming, to remain simple, that the purpose of trade regulation is to reduce or even eliminate obstacles to trade. Now, what's happening is that we've moved from a trade opening system where the main issue was reduction of obstacles to trade, the purpose of which was to protect producers from foreign competition, tariffs, subsidies. This era is over. It's done. I mean, not yet, but historically it's done. The real problem for the future of trade regulation, i.e. trade opening, i.e. reduction of obstacles to trade, is convergence of standards, the purpose of which is to protect not the producer, but the consumer. And this is where your question comes in. And we have an extremely good example of that in the services negotiation, which are now taking place in Geneva, so-called TISA. We had an excellent example of that, why TTIP was still in motion, about data. Most of the services now entail data flows. Tariffs on bicycles or scrap metal are ideologically neutral. Who owns the data and what you do with the value, which is the question that came, is something which is ideologically polarized. Some systems say data is my thing, I want it to be kept and I want power on the use of that. Others are saying this is crazy, it only works if it's totally open, US versus Europe. So that's the thing to come. And it's something that, again, will be more about, if you want, harmonizing cultures, which is a very tricky exercise, rather than just leveling the playing field in production systems. So we are, and what we're talking about connectivity and data, takes us to this world, which will be much more politically complex and sensitive than has been in the past.
Thank you.
Angela, oh, sorry.
Mark?
I was just going to answer the question about data-driven business models. The first thing to say is there's many different forms of data, and we're completely underestimating, I think, the value of industrial data. We're going to move to a world which I think is basically asset-light and service-heavy. So if you think the typical car is basically idle 92% of the time, why on earth would you buy a car if you can buy it by the half an hour or buy it by the hour? There is value in the utility of actually using that car for that limited period of time. And I think a lot of our younger people today, as they grow older, will recognize the value of doing that. That has some very interesting sort of issues about the economics of the automotive industry going forward. But I think that the value, it's whether it's an aircraft engine, whether it's Rolls-Royce, GE working with sort of Amazon, looking at the performance metrics of the aero engine, whether it's Otis lifts looking at the performance of the lifts so that they can charge a service by the uptime, not by selling the actual lift. You move to this world where the value is in the data and the performance that you can attribute to that data. And it's in the same way that, in fact, now that some of the tire companies, you don't buy car tires. The fleet lorries don't buy car tires. They buy the 1,000 kilometers worth of tire wear because they know that through the sensor technology, they can optimize fuel consumption, tire wear, and they can provide value and service to the fleet owners. So that's the model that I was trying to sort of get across about how data-driven business models are going to move forward. So I think that there's some, and that creates some interesting shifts in terms of where the sources of value are. I think one of the really interesting observations, which is really important for this room, is that the opportunities lie on industry borders very often, not just within industry verticals. And so it's the cross-border dimension, or the cross-boundary dimensions, and that's where, if you look at the moment, some very interesting sort of organizations coming together. So Rolls-Royce coming together with Microsoft, Bayer working with sort of Google, Procter & Gamble working with Amazon. These are the new sort of consortiums. This is the new reality of where we're working on basically data-driven business models.
Okay. And just very briefly, I think if we look at the sort of disproportionate distribution of data business models versus what consumers do today, I believe only entrepreneurship and innovation can fix that. Why not create a model where the actual provider of data is making a profit from providing his data? And that's something that will be solved, I believe, in the near future, because it's not going to be able to continue like this forever.
Taking the research and development question, yes, for us, it's obviously the case that research and development is absolutely central to the business model. One point I'd make about the data-rich economy is where it used to be years between research and development. In our business, it's often minutes, because we can simulate to a near optimal design and then move, for instance, to 3D production. But also on the broader question of the social return on investment thing. When you have a radical intervention, and that's what Hyperloop is, that, for instance, brings a Rust Belt city that is currently maybe 3 hours away from a thriving metropolitan capital to within 10 minutes, it changes the value of that space. And one of the big challenges is, how do you put a fence around that, a ring fence around that, so that the uplift in property value doesn't just go into the developer's back pocket, but actually creates social benefit? And that can be done through some form of special purpose vehicle or that kind of thing. So in terms of how do we valorize social return, the models that you traditionally see today on employment creation, environmental benefits, wider economic benefits, they will variously account for maybe 9 to about 15% of a project, typically. And that is to grossly underestimate the impact of a radical transformation. And that's one of the debates that we need to have with policymakers here in Brussels, is how do we get the models right? So when hours do become minutes, and when data becomes value, how do we capture it?
Thank you. Okay, we're going to be out of time. So we are out of time. So I'm just going to thank our panel. This Connectivity for Prosperity has opened many different concepts of connectivity and also questioned what we mean by prosperity. I want to thank Pascal in particular for putting emotion into the concept of prosperity, not just the economics. Mark, I'd like to thank you for reminding us how much more bang for the buck can be got out of existing industrial systems or new technology systems by connecting physical and information systems. I'd like to thank Alan for his vision of a different transportation future, which allows different new forms of community and value ecosystems. I'd like to thank Simon for coming along and telling us all about how entrepreneurs would like to work with regulators, because actually it's between them that we have, I think from the last speaker, it's not about old versus new power. It's about the interaction between old and new value and power systems that really is going to shape the future. I'd like to thank our panel. Thank you.